Hey, Todd Hampson here today, and I want to talk about a really important aspect of Bible prophecy, and it's this: how do you interpret Bible prophecy? A lot of people, don't realize that there's a couple different approaches to that. Matter of fact, there's about four different interpretation methods that are used for prophecy. But when you kind of distill them down to their basic approach, there's really only two approaches to Bible prophecy. Either you interpret Bible prophecy literally or you interpret it allegorically. So those are really the two approaches. So that's what we're going to look at today. And it's really the most important factor in how you approach prophecy, and it affects how you view so many things when you study scripture. For example, Revelation 20, when it talks about 1,000-year reign of Christ, is that a literal 1,000 years or is that allegorical for something? The 144,000 Jewish witnesses from 12 tribes in the book of Revelation, are they literally 144,000 Jewish witnesses, or does that represent something related to the church? The two witnesses that we're told will appear before the beginning of the tribulation or at the beginning of the tribulation period, are they two witnesses that represent something related to the church, or is it literally two biblical figures that are going to show up at the beginning of the tribulation period? It also impacts questions about Israel and the church. For example, the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants, are those literally unconditional, ongoing, eternal covenants with Israel? Or are they allegorical that really refer to the church, and the church has kind of taken those things over? Same thing with the judgments. When you read scripture carefully, the details wherever a judgment is talked about, like an end time judgment, when you look at it literally, there's so many specific details that it appears that there are several judgments. Some of them happen at the same time and in the same general time period, but there's a Bema seat judgment, or the judgment seat of Christ, where Christians have to stand before God to kind of answer for what they did after salvation. We read about that in Romans 14. The nations are judged in Matthew 25. Ezekiel 20 talks about Israel being judged. And then finally, in Revelation 20, this is the one that most people are familiar with in terms of a big, clear view of judgment. It's what's known as the Great White Throne Judgment. So whether you approach Scripture literally or allegorically, all of these judgments could be talking about the same thing, just spoken about in a different way. Or if we take them literally, when you look at the details, each of those judgments is for a specific group of people. So again, this approach really does impact how you view all of Scripture. Obviously, when Jesus taught, there are some basic spiritual principles that he taught that doesn't impact that. But when you're looking at the Bible as a whole, the story of Scripture from Genesis to Revelation, God's activity in the Old Testament with Israel and God's activity in the New Testament with the church, how you approach Scripture, allegorically or literally, impacts everything. And I think it's something that every believer who calls himself a disciple of Christ has to figure out for themselves and has to land somewhere. That was not always easy to do. When you look at church history, for example, obviously, first and second century, Christianity was exploding everywhere, and then Christians were heavily persecuted, so they were literally just trying to survive. The early church fathers all held a literal view of Scripture, particularly with Bible prophecy. They didn't have it all formulated and hashed out, but generally speaking, they used a literal point of view. But in Alexandria, Egypt, there was a school of thought there that saw everything in Scripture as allegory. Even passages about salvation and heaven and hell, it was all allegory. It wasn't literal. It didn't really mean literal things. And that became an issue, and kind of the literal view and the allegorical view butted heads. And then if you've heard of a gentleman by the name of St. Augustine of Hippo, he kind of was a well-respected theologian, and he wrestled with the two, and he kind of came up with this concept of, generally speaking, a literal interpretation of Scripture. He literally believed in heaven and hell, and a future judgment, and that each person needs to accept Christ to be saved. But when it came to other things, particularly eschatology and things of that nature, he held an allegorical view. And this became the dominant view of the church. And you can understand why, because in 70 AD, Israel was attacked by the Romans, and Jews were scattered all over the world. And then 120 AD, there was another attack, which further decimated the Jewish people and really ended Israel as a nation, really ended Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, that kind of thing. So by the time you get to the 200s and 300s, believers were reading these passages about a literal kingdom where Jesus is going to rule and reign from Jerusalem. They're reading about specific prophecies about Israel in the end times, and they're looking around saying there is no Israel. The Jewish people are gone. The nation is gone. It's a Roman province now. It's not the temple is not there. The temple was destroyed. They're not doing sacrifices anymore. So you can see why at that time period in history, this allegorical view may have popped up. But we have hindsight, and we can see the error in that. But that became the dominant view in churches all over the world for over 1,000 years. And then you get to the Reformation, and then that's when things, we kind of return to a literal hermeneutic for the Bible, particularly when it came to salvation. But we stopped there. We didn't go into eschatology, and then that kind of developed a little bit later. But anyway, this isn't really a historical overview. This really is a discussion of interpreting the Bible literally or allegorically. So I want to kind of get back to that. So we also call the literal interpretation method the grammatical historical method. And what that means is we should interpret scripture just like we do any other language, obviously taking into account the grammar that's used, the historical things that were going on at the time, the original audience, all of that you have to take into account. So it's not hyper literalism, but it's literal language. It's taking it at face value, so to speak. That accounts for symbols and figures of speech. Obviously, there's a lot of different poetic language used in Scripture, and we know that those things mean other things. For example, there's passages where it says God will protect his people like a mother hen covers them with her wings. Well, we know God doesn't have feathers or wings. We know that that's poetic language in the book of Revelation, and a lot of the Old Testament prophets as well. We see a lot of symbolism, but the symbols mean something. They're clearly symbols. And in Revelation, for example, half of the meanings of the symbols are given in the context of Revelation itself. It explains it right there. And the other half are symbols that point directly to the Old Testament. They're things that find their meaning in Scripture. They're direct allusions to the Old Testament. John was purposely tying Revelation to the Old Testament prophets. So again, literal does not mean hyper literal. It does take into account symbolism and figures of speech and normal casual language like we do every day. But here's the thing. When you look at Bible prophecy, literal versus allegorical, those who hold an allegorical view of the end times in Israel get into muddy waters because, well, number one, replacement theology came out of this view as well, where people see, well, the church has replaced Israel. Israel's gone, all the promises to Israel. Obviously, that God was talking about something else allegorically. But here's the thing. When you look at fulfilled prophecy, whether you're talking about the first coming of Christ and all the prophecies that were fulfilled, whether you're talking about sweeping prophecies of Gentile kingdoms that we read about in Daniel chapter 2 and 7, which were clearly fulfilled in history over a long period of time, those prophecies were fulfilled literally. So all prophecy that has been fulfilled was fulfilled literally. There's no indication whatsoever in Scripture, unless we force it on the text, that we're supposed to switch hermeneutics or switch Bible interpretation methods and then say, but all the future stuff related to Israel and eschatology is symbolic. So God is the same today, yesterday, today, and forever. He doesn't change with the shadows of change. He's the same God. He's one single author over the entire book from Genesis to Revelation. And there's no indication anywhere in Scripture that we switch hermeneutics and then suddenly go to allegory for the end times. Now, a huge modern day glaring neon sign that we are to interpret Scripture and prophecy literally is the fulfillment of prophecy that occurred in 1948. Every Old Testament prophet except for Jonah prophesied that Israel would become a nation again in the last days, or as a setup for all things end time. So you could see again how people wrestled with the literal interpretation method when Israel was not in her land, but they neglected to see until the late 1700s. It kind of came around 1800s. People started to say, well, wait a minute. These prophecies say Israel is literally going to become a nation again. So we need to start looking for that. So there was a grassroots movement in that era that developed into a whole system of theology, looking for the return of Israel as a bona fide, literal, physical nation. And that's exactly what happened in 1948. So Israel becoming a nation in 1948 is the neon sign, the super sign that lets us know God is setting the stage for all things end times, but also it lets us know we are to interpret prophecy literally. Again, this is something that I think every believer should wrestle to the ground for yourself. Whatever church you're in, whatever church background you come from, whatever approach to Scripture you've taken to date, I want to encourage you to really think through this and think about what is the best way to interpret Scripture. Is it literal or is it allegorical? And if it's allegorical, who gets to decide what the allegory means? That's the other thing. We start to force our own views on the text versus letting the text tell us what it means. And the only approach to Scripture that can do that from cover to cover is the literal interpretation method. So I hope that helps. I hope that equips you and kind of answers some questions. And really, if you've never heard that before, I hope that helps you look at Scripture differently. I hope that helps you consider Bible prophecy as an apologetic and helps you consider the promises that are yet future that we have to look forward to. All things eschatology, all things end times. There's some beautiful things there that await us. And I challenge you and I encourage you to kind of look at Scripture, take a fresh look using the literal interpretation method. I'll talk to you soon. And hey, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and send this to somebody that you think would benefit from it. Talk to you soon.